Dragon Quest IV is one of the most ambitious games I've ever played, boasting a large-scale narrative with 5 chapters and 5 different protagonists on NES hardware. The first 4 chapters' respective party members are all defined by roles that could easily be taken up by nameless NPCs in prior Dragon Quests. A castle soldier, a princess and her 2 attendants, a shopkeeper, and a fortune-teller dancer duo. Throughout these 4 introductory chapters, you will gradually piece together information about 3 figures who will eventually play key roles in the 5th chapter that takes up the bulk of the game's runtime. The remake opts to open up on a typical day in the hero's life, but in the original NES version, they do not show up until Chapter 5 itself, building a mystery of what they're actually like. The very first mention of this hero is in Chapter 1, where a dying soldier tells Ragnar the villain's plan to resurrect the ruler of evil and kill a hero who's supposedly capable of stopping them. The chapter concludes with Ragnar leaving his homeland in order to search for this hero. Several chapters later, you gain control of this hero and find out they're a regular villager. In direct contrast to the prior trilogy of games heroes who set out on their respective journeys due to a family connection they knew about from the start, DQ4's hero only found out about their true nature through an attack led on their village that they're the sole survivor of. The source of their chosen one status is an angelic being falling to Earth and having a child with a woodsman. Now, while it's impossible to even guess where Chunsoft got the idea for this plot point, Jesus, it takes on a more spiritual tone than the equivalent title of Erdrick in DQ1-3, which is a title granted by institutions and presumably has material benefits. Shortly after, this hero meets up with the sister pair from Chapter 4 and goes on a search for the rest of the party members, represented by 7 lights in Mina's fortune. A quirk of DQ4's NES version is that during Chapter 5, your supporting party members act on their own, despite prior chapters of the game giving full control of party members. This design choice is usually polarizing, but speaking purely about DQ4 and not every single implementation of it, it's easy to manage. In comparison to, say, Persona, the amount of options available to you in an earlier Dragon Quest is low enough that adjusting the tactics menu should usually guarantee what action you get. If anything, the faster speed of battles due to less menuing means this system benefits the player more than the decreased range of control hinders them. The one notable case of the AI being hard to cooperate with, a healing magic user's insistence on using insta-kill spells instead, is for a party member whose role can easily be filled by a different one. It's an interesting alternative approach to DQ-style combat where you're more so playing the role of a shepherd, capable of guiding the other party members but having to account for what happens when they end up straying from the flock. But how about the other 2 figures built up over the course of the game? The actions of the various minor antagonists you'll encounter usually tie back to resurrecting the ruler of evil, Estark. Estark is mythologized as a uniquely strong being, both inside the story of the game and outside of it due to being a recurring superboss in subsequent Dragon Quests. However, in his game of origin, he isn't even the final boss and is quickly defeated by the heroes before he can fully awaken his power. No response, just a corpse. The same string of attacks used for the corpses of regular humans. The actual main antagonist of Dragon Quest IV and the one trying to resurrect Estark is Pesaro the Manslayer, whose first mention was through the Chapter 1 antagonist being named Sorrow's Shadow or Pesaro's Pawn depending on the translation. In Chapter 2, Elena was supposed to face off against him in a tournament, but then he suspiciously doesn't show up. Elena then returns home to a suspiciously empty castle, and it's easy to wonder if these 2 events had some correlation. Flash forward to the destruction of the hero's village at the start of Chapter 5, which Pesaro was present for, and the player still doesn't get to see what he looks like. Your first view of his appearance is in the inherently abstracted form of a dream. His design is fairly human-like, but what matters more is that he's announcing to some girl he has held up in a tower that he's going to exterminate all of humanity. The location where this dream takes place is Rose Hill, an optional town populated primarily by dwarves and animals who all view Pesaro more favorably. Should you visit it, you'll find out that Pesaro constructed the tower to protect the girl in the dream named Rose from humans seeking to exploit the properties of her tears. And this genuine good deed caused the town of Rose Hill to organically emerge from other beings seeking similar protection. Rose herself, while opposing Pesaro's plan, still has genuine affection for him and cries at him going down a path that will surely result in his death. And then after you defeat Estark, it turns out that one of Pesaro's underlings schemed to have Rose killed behind his back in the hopes that it would get him to actually focus on destroying humanity. Well, if we're being specific to the localized NES script, mentions of what happened to Rose say she was abducted, but the narrative treats it with a level of finality that makes it really easy to tell what the real implication is. This causes Pesaro to retreat to Hell, activate the secret of evolution that Estark used long ago, and undergo an ego death of sorts, completely losing his memories aside from his desire to destroy all of humanity and constantly mutating over the course of the final battle. The ultimate irony of Pissarro's fate is how, despite his hatred of humanity, the emotions of love, anger, and hate that drove him to the path of self-destruction are human ones. His design is more reminiscent of a human than your typical Dragon Quest monster, and a spin-off game even retroactively makes him half-human. His use of the secret of evolution was only possible due to humanity, both in its rediscovery by the alchemist Edgar and how he obtained it through Bolzak and Kelion, who were themselves human before using it. The name and effect of the secret of evolution are easy to connect to human ingenuity, constantly rising above what we were previously capable of, regardless of the cost incurred towards ourselves and the world. This is juxtaposed with the ending of the game where the hero is offered a chance to live in the Zenithian castle, effectively ascending to godhood, but rejects it. Now, while it's impossible to even guess where Chunsoft got the idea for this plot, Goku, it's interesting to see a character who takes from Jesus in the ways that medieval fantasy heroes typically do make this kind of choice. This lines up with the game's aforementioned choice to give its party members traits associated with insignificant NPCs in past Dragon Quests. The biggest example of that is Torneko Taloon, who is lacking in combat ability and whose respective chapter centers on the actions of a regular shopkeeper as opposed to the typical task of defeating a boss. DQ4 positions the positive traits of humanity as existing within inherent insignificance and imperfection. Pissarro's backstory makes it pretty clear that humanity can and will commit legitimate evils. And speaking on mechanical terms, the decreased level of control you have over your party members means they are almost certainly going to make mistakes. But rather than Pissarro, who seeks to erase that imperfection from himself through the secret of evolution, the heroes embrace that imperfection and do good in spite of it. I've been thinking about that pop culture idea of what human nature is. You know, the kind of stories that exist to say how good, strong, etc. humans are. Why are you getting in my way, Kimberly? Ha 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 ha! Humans are all cool and strong. You may be Pride, but if that's the case, then Edward Elric is homophobic. What? I fully understand why humanity having innate goodness and so sure the capability to overcome everything is seen as an uplifting message, but it's also an easy one to make. What that one meme from a couple years back showed is that you can easily take whatever image you feel like, add in the two text lines cruel indifference of the universe and indomitable human spirit, and then you're done. Speaking as someone who loves both RPGs and the types of manga they frequently draw from, I often find a lot of these stories' usage of that specific look straight at the camera, humanity is pretty cool I guess, thesis statement to be really half-hearted. Not to engage in discourse surrounding multiple schools of philosophy I have never properly researched, but I personally believe that human nature is too malleable and too dependent on the current material conditions to really be wholly good or even wholly bad. My personal rule when it comes to stories about the nature of humanity is that humans can be good is more interesting than humans are good. Acts of good resonate more strongly when they're more difficult to do. Likewise, when it comes to the opposite side of the coin, the evil humanity is capable of is far more horrifying when there's still a choice we can make, but we choose wrong regardless. And what made me want to talk about DQ4 is how it's able to hit that can be good note on hardware that limits what it can do as far as scripting, blocking, and other important tools for a narratively driven game. I'm specifically interested in how it was able to hit said note through the lens of its silent protagonist. Whereas a series like Final Fantasy had a talking protagonist as early as 1988, Dragon Quest still sticks to its archetypical silent protagonist in its most recent entries. There's a mentality within RPG spaces that silent protagonists are inherently lesser than talking ones, and I want to do what I can to push back against that with this video. I want to look at two other games that explore the complications of human nature through the lens of a Dragon Quest style silent protagonist. One of the many reasons that Chrono Trigger is mythologized as the only good game and no one else knows how to make good games is the dream team that played a big role in its conception. Hironobu Sakaguchi, Akira Toriyama, and Yuji Horii. Three big names known for their contributions to both Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, as well as the niche Journey to the West adaptation, have combined their expertise to create a one-of-a-kind experience that will go down in history as only the third best 1995 SNES RPG about exploring multiple versions of the same world. Okay, fine, you got me. I'll stop making needlessly inflammatory jokes and stick to my genuine opinions on Chrono Trigger, like how it's only the second best 1995 SNES RPG about. As expected from a game with both Yuji Horii and Akira Toriyama playing notable roles, the Dragon Quest DNA is very apparent with Chrono Trigger. Its protagonist, Chrono, is similar to the archetypical Dragon Quest hero. His character is expressed through the same language, which is to say none at all. He marries into royalty, and his mechanical role as a mixed physical and magical attacker who specifically uses electric magic is also in line with DQ heroes. Chrono is a Dragon Quest hero adapted to fit in a more technologically advanced setting than that series. As for what Chrono Trigger has to say about humanity, it leads more into the humans are good category than humans can be good. In comparison to DQ4, Chrono Trigger portrays human ingenuity as a wholly good thing. Plot summary for a game you've almost certainly heard someone else talk about before me. A parasite thing named Lavos causes the apocalypse and you have to stop it. Your party members do just that and use technology to overcome what were thought to be unshakable laws, whether through the game's various methods of time travel or using the Chrono Trigger to literally undo Chrono's death. Chrono Trigger's philosophy on human ingenuity is best exemplified by one of its biggest selling points, popularizing the concept of New Game Plus. Your party members now just fucking steamroll everything that could have ever been perceived as a challenge at one point.
There's a good chance this is actually a 6-7.
Another of Chrono Trigger's big selling points, its multiple endings, give you the incentive to do that to the rules of time themselves, often for the purposes of comedy. You're fully able to just beat Lavos in the encounter where Chrono was supposed to die and alter reality so much that the characters get to meet the staff who worked on the game. Hi, Mr. Toriyama, big fan. Me and my two friends, Benjamin Franklin and Second Benjamin Franklin, would be very interested in seeing you draw Dr. Gero and Grandpa Gohan passionately making out. Oh, you're doing it for free? And you're glad to have heard this idea before the manga's supposed to end because you love it so much you want it to be there in some form? Well, surely that won't have any negative consequence. Surge, the protagonist of Chrono Cross, is just like Chrono in many regards. Silent protagonist, same age, similar elemental alignment, same plot beat as starting their journey by getting woken up by mom. Oh, and also they both fucking died. Surge was fated to drown in what should have been every timeline, but in the specific timeline you started the game in, Kid saved them, creating the Dead Sea. An amalgamation of various futures that were eliminated through alterations of fate. There is a clear difference in how undoing death is treated by Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross. The former game has it as a fairly consequenceless action, but that is very much not the case for the latter game. In fact, the primary eliminated future in the Dead Sea is the apocalyptic timeline that Chrono Trigger is about preventing. Chrono Cross regularly raises questions about Chrono Trigger's pro-human ingenuity philosophy. Chrono and friends' defeat of Lavos only ended up allowing it to grow even stronger. Balthasar, one of the three gurus in Chrono Trigger, ends up doing further research on the nature of time, which results in the creation of Chronopolis and a supercomputer named Fate that controls all of humanity's actions. And then when Surge ends up defeating said supercomputer, it ends up releasing a threat it was meant to seal. Just as free will is an idea explored in Chrono Cross's narrative, choice is a recurring motif throughout Chrono Cross on a mechanical level. The equipable elements that the game's combat system is built around expand the level of choice you have in building party members. The limited uses of said elements in a given battle emphasize the choice of when to use them. The stamina bar adds a greater level of choice to standard attacks. You are given a massive playable cast of 45 party members in a way that pronounces which ones you choose to use in your individual playthrough. The party always has the choice to run away from enemies, even bosses, although doing so in boss fights usually means you just go back to fighting them. And there's a notable route split decently early into the game based on whether or not you choose to find a cure for an illness that Kid contracts. If you choose to help Kid out, you're required to destroy the homeland of some dwarves, which in turn causes them to destroy the homeland of some fairies. And even if you choose not to, said dwarves' homeland still ends up getting destroyed and the quest with the fairies is still available. It's a choice with no good options where you either actively cause harm or do nothing to prevent that harm. After this quest, there's a scene by a campfire where Kid laments her past as an orphan who also had her adopted family taken from her and in turn the nature of humanity. Crikey, in this world the underhanded always gets the last laugh. Only the ones who don't think anything of hurting others are the ones who get bloodstained fortunes. The ones who kill, the ones who devour, they're the ones who survive, mate. That's the only rule of this world. The great species of mankind, our wonderful world filled with love and happiness? Don't make me laugh, mate! Whether or not humanity's ability to do harm is on an ontological basis is another big question in Chrono Cross. In Chrono Trigger, the dinosaur people's hatred of humanity is cartoon villain shit, and the only question they raise is who on the dev team was the Getter Robofan. In Chrono Cross, the descendants of those dinosaur people's condemnation of humanity is given more weight. One of the major plot reveals is the fact that the type of intelligence we traditionally see as a core part of humanity was only obtained through the parasitic Lavos. Surge himself is the vessel of a significant piece of Lavos, further connecting them to this idea as the various forms of fate being able to take control of their body and use them to do harm is a constant concern. It's such a striking sequence when Surge suddenly starts talking and the party members rejoin them in the manner that they typically do when you go back to gameplay, but when you do an input, Lynx moves instead. I'm enamored by the insignificant detail of Surge having a decreased hit rate while in Lynx's body, as if they're struggling to control something that wasn't made for them. You then get your ass beat by your former party members, and as Kid manages to piece together what exactly is going on, she gets stabbed in a cutscene you saw before starting the game proper. You then get sent into another dimension, have all your allies taken from you, become unjustly hated by NPCs, and have to go along with what someone who pretty clearly has her own agenda wants. Surge is not only a silent protagonist in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense, as they have little ability to advocate for themselves within the narrative. The choice to make Surge a silent protagonist when other PS1 Square RPGs further moved away from that writing style to be more cinematic only serves to emphasize just how little agency they and all of humanity seemingly have. Going back to where we were before discussing Ginyu Slop, a recurring word in the game script that jumped out at me while playing is devour. It's used in several notable places like the aforementioned kid speech, the Drakengard's condemnation of humanity, and multiple mentions of Lavos, including its final Devourer of Time form. There's an animalistic connotation to that word, quickly and mindlessly tearing into something to act on an instinctual desire. We could very well only be set apart from animals through the larger scale of harm we can inflict. In order to survive, all living things in this world fight desperately and devour those they defeat. Must one kill other living things in order to survive? Must one destroy another world in order to allow one's world to continue? The wounded in turn wound and torment those weaker than they themselves are. There are only the killers and the killed, the sinners who are judged and the victims that do the judging. What meaning is there to such a world? But in the final battle, you're given one final choice to prove this belief wrong. If you reduce the Devourer of Time's HP to 0 like a normal boss fight, you get the bad ending, where it retreats and you will inevitably repeat the cycle. However, you have the ability to reject combat and use a melody to appeal to the girl Scala who is forcibly fused with Lavos and free her. The speech she gives afterwards starts out appealing to concepts like survival of the fittest, very much in line with the uses of the word devour and the notion of an unshakable fate. But she eventually shifts to asserting that we are fully capable of rising beyond our insignificance and contributing to the future. Every trial and tribulation in Chrono Cross's 30 to 40 hour runtime ultimately leads up to the game saying that there is no such thing as a useless life form. A sentiment that has aged poorly because Iraq war veterans weren't a thing in 1999 and I've been told that saying that is offensive to them. Chrono Cross is a game where whether you're for or against it, it's really hard to have an opinion on it that doesn't sound inflammatory in some way. Either it's an affront to the all-time classic Chrono Trigger, or it's proof that said classic wasn't actually that good. And it's a game where ghost-adjacent entities of said classic's cast tell you that you ruined everything at one point, so that was bound to happen. It's a strange game filled with all kinds of mechanical eccentricities, pessimistic sentiments, and a party member named Fun Guy announcing that he's going to kill you. However, the genuinely optimistic takeaway it has when it comes to humanity as a whole, and you specifically, only ends up shining even brighter when you have to go through all that to reach it. I know I tend to be pretty jokingly dismissive of Trigger when it comes up on the channel just by virtue of the inherent comedy in talking about an obviously good game in that matter, but the optimism it has to a fault clearly has some value seeing as how it still ended up surviving when Cross put it through the ringer. Maybe impulsively making incendiary comments on beloved games because that is just what social media algorithms have primed us to do to stay on these sites longer just isn't worth it. I want to reject that and Drakengard is a game that has lingered in my mind in the 2 years since I played it. It's interesting looking back on the video I made not too long after finishing it to compare and contrast with my current thoughts on the game and see how much my reasons for liking it have changed. Now, a lot of that is just the usual, your 20s are an inherently volatile period of your life and identifying with the person you were even just 2 years ago is really hard thing. These are the videos I made before walking an hour in the freezing cold after blowing a job interview changed my views on everything, and these are the videos I made before I threw up in the bathroom sink as the beginning of a mental low point that caused me to change my views on everything a second time. But I also think Drakengard is the kind of experience where as you reflect on it, you keep finding new things to appreciate about it. If you haven't played the game, your primary exposure to it beyond its connection to Nier is more often than not going to be memes. Out-of-context gameplay footage, Chapter 4 on the ground, ravings about how mythically bad the experience is. It's by no means rare for a game to get this style of mythical reputation, but the thing separating Drakengard from your Sonic 06's is the role of Yoko Taro as the game's director. Because Yoko Taro is often designated as a genius auteur TM, it was very easy for Drakengard to retroactively get designated as bad on purpose. Everything about Drakengard can just be explained as a wacky little trick from the same guy who deletes your save. Of course, that's an oversimplification. I wouldn't necessarily say that the idea floating around that Drakengard hates the player is completely unfounded. The mysterious ending E being unlocked by the long and arduous process of obtaining every weapon, then thrusting the characters into real-life Tokyo and you the player into a difficult rhythm minigame is proof of that. But after a certain point, the focus on the meta aspect of Drakengard becomes an easy out in discussions about the game. Something you can use as the sole answer to any given question and not look beyond that. The feel of the on-ground gameplay makes more sense with the context of other early Musos and can be pretty fun if you learn the intricacies of its mechanics like the rewards for getting a big enough combo. The soundtrack has a lot of purpose in its distortion of the samples being used beyond "it sounds weird lol," and most relevant to what I want to talk about, a lot of the character writing is overlooked. Part of my reason for making this video is because my friend Sammy recently uploaded their 4-hour deep dive on the game, which I highly recommend. The extent to which they talked about these characters that I wouldn't blame most people for boiling down to their respective social taboos made me think about what I valued in the central character dynamic between Kaim and Angelus. In typical Drakengard fashion, I'm going to explain this by talking about a completely different anime/manga instead. 1972's Devilman is in the DNA of God knows how many manga, anime, and video games that have come since. While I haven't been able to find any staff that worked on Drakengard mentioning it, the game's very unsubtle anime inspirations of Berserk and Evangelion were themselves inspired by Devilman. Regardless, Devilman has a similar texture to Drakengard. Just as going after endings B through E feels like disrupting some sort of natural order and altering the world for the worse, there's a creepypasta-esque mystique to the brutality within the manga version of Devilman in comparison to the more child-friendly anime that ran alongside it. If you thought Drakengard hated the player, it's got nothing on Akira Fudo looking you straight out the eye and telling you that you in particular are going to hell. Devilman and Drakengard's respective brands of cynicism are humorous for similar reasons. Posting out-of-context Drakengard gameplay is funny for the same reasons that it's funny to post out-of-context Ryo Asuka panels. That Ryo Asuka fellow is worth paying attention to. They reveal themselves as Satan, come out as gay for protagonist Akira Fudo, kill everyone, and pave the way for God knows how many evil anime boys since. What makes Ryo such a compelling character is the juxtaposition between the kinds of objectively evil acts you'd expect from the literal devil and genuine expressions of love. The final image that Devilman leaves you on is the conclusion to an off-screen battle where Ryo is laying right next to Akira, expressing genuine regret for the way things turned out and tearing up by the death of the target of their affection. Their evil was not on an ontological level, and they were fully capable of genuine heartfelt emotions, which makes that evil all the more heartbreaking. And that kind of twisted love that defines Ryo Asuka also defines Kaim and Angelus. In the 2 years since I played Drakengard, I've replayed that opening stretch more often than I replay parts of any other RPG just by virtue of how the game's mission structure works. Getting footage for a video, making sure the physical copy I paid $70 for works, creating a Judas Priest Nightcore AMV, no matter the reason, I'm gonna end up back here somehow. It's hard not to be drawn in by the chaos of battle being felt even in a solitary room, and then the subsequent view of a more cluttered battlefield, with our protagonist in the middle of it, eventually taking a significant wound. From the unnatural camera movement upon entering the first mission, there's a feeling of uneasiness pervading said mission and Drakengard as a whole. There's an especially repetitive quality to the track for this mission, and the yellows of the sky are muted by the grays of the clouds obscuring the sun. Said grays blend in with those of the soldiers and the ground to make the color palette even more dismal and to accentuate the red of the bloodshed Kaim will end up inflicting. Speaking of Kaim, his characterization throughout Drakengard centers around how bloodthirsty he is, going well beyond the level of violence that is necessary to defend against an aggressor like the Empire and actively enjoying his role in this whole ordeal. An interesting trick played by the choreography of the opening cutscene is how one of the first things we see Kaim do is maneuvering around a soldier to stab him in the back. Not only is this an act that is generally seen as underhanded, but it's one that Kaim ends up on the receiving end of shortly after, framing Kaim's brutality as being the same of those he's up against. Oh, and I also lied about this video centering on silent protagonists because Kaim speaks.
Empire rats, you shall feed the ravens.
There's a very blunt quality to dialogue within Drakengard that adds a lot to the game's tone, but what's worth pointing out about this line in particular is the mentions of animals. Both the common use of rats to deem people as pests and the similarly common reference to scavenger animals for a setting defined by constant death. Invoking the name of animals in this fashion happens several times in Drakengard's early game.
You interrupt us! Go back to hell, hyenas!
Still they come? Persistent insects.
And that doesn't just stop at words. When the opening cutscene switches from Fury Eye Inner Room to the scene of the battle, there's a shot of a raven eagerly awaiting its next meal before panning down to said battle. The in-battle UI elements all have a depiction of some type of bird, most notably a raven pecking at the number of kills every time said number increases. The motif of animals within Drakengard serves a similar purpose to the uses of the word devour within Chrono Cross's scripts, alluding to the simpler, more barbaric rules of survival of the fittest and the question of whether or not we as humans have truly moved away from that. I like this pop-up. You see that there's time limits and think, okay, I better keep an eye on that, but when you actually check for one of those time limits, it's long enough that 99% of the time it will never affect you. Drakengard's habit of placing the player in seemingly urgent situations that the reality of gameplay doesn't match up with is such a charming little quirk. Like, Kaim enters this mission mortally wounded, but would still be willing to spend an hour fighting enemies if need be. The game's relationship with time as a whole is an interesting kind of strange. When you get to the side quests needed for Ending D, they're written in such a way where any of them occurring in the time frame of their respective chapters just seems illogical, as if you, the player, are changing the events of the game out of a desire for it to go on longer. Kaim heals the aforementioned wound for reluctantly making a pact with the dragon Angelus despite hating dragons due to one of them killing his parents and Angelus herself hating humans. However, this pact comes at a cost.
So, your voice is lost. A trifling price to pay for a pact. No matter. I shall speak for the both of us.
Kaim is now a proper silent protagonist and a stylistic choice that an interview describes as an homage to Dragon Quest protagonists. It's such a cool take on the idea of a silent protagonist to not have it as merely a lens that the player perceives the protagonist in question through, but instead as a limitation that said protagonist is subject to in the universe. Angelus's "I shall speak for both of us" quote sums up how this is going to go for Kaim, as she is constantly going on about how much she hates humans during missions.
No human mortal is a match for my crimson wings. Fools! Must you slaughter so many? Humans are a race to be pitied.
A sizable percentage of Drakengard's dialogue being from someone who's regularly saying shit like this adds to the bluntness of the game's script that I mentioned earlier. What's really interesting about these musings is how they're affected by the context of the pact between Kaim and Angelus putting them on even terms. Kaim is actively slaughtering people and getting some form of pleasure out of it from frame 1, which adds this element of hypocrisy to any time Angelus says humans are inherently violent, lesser, etc., because she is clearly going along with one of the worst examples of that. Just as Pisaro's hatred of humans was driven by very human emotions, there's this level of irony to Angelus's belief that humans are destructive, aiding a particularly destructive human. And from there, Drakengard enters a cycle of Kaim and Angelus entering battles that end with what little progress they make getting undone, constantly repeating until the various apocalyptic events of the game's endings.
My brethren devoured her.
There is no hope for anyone in this world, and the two leads arguably caused its various ends to happen faster. However, there's exactly one ending in Drakengard where things turn out somewhat okay. Ending A. In this final chapter, Kaim and Angelus show some level of mutual respect, if not romantic feelings for each other, and both make a choice that goes against their respective natures. Kaim chooses not to kill Mana despite her begging for it, and Angelus engages in a self-sacrifice for the sake of humanity. Of course, this one good ending that a player is more often than not going to perceive as a footstep to later endings does not make Drakengard any less bleak. What it really does is recontextualize what exactly is so bleak about the game's theming. It would be one thing if Drakengard just said humans will always be doomed by their tendency towards senseless violence and so short the acts of uncaring higher powers and left it at that. But ending A gives us a glimpse into a scenario that, while not entirely free of hardship, shows that even an extremely bloodthirsty human was able to overcome his own violent tendencies, foil the plot of the higher powers in question, and find love. Endings B through E are then framed as a choice a player has to make, and a wrong choice at that. The horror underlying Drakengard isn't that humans are incapable of doing good. They are fully capable of doing good, but for whatever reason, they choose not to.
You have no control, not even your own will.
Whoa. No, it's the end of the series. That's the last...
But this is my will.
John, would you please get out of the booth?
Who is John? I am the hand of God hovering above. Hey, get your hands off.
John,
Hey,
please.
no,